And now the conclusion of Freddy vs. Jason, the novelization by Stephan Hand. Chapter 21. Jason cocked his head to one side. He stood quite motionless, his arms hanging limp by his side. He was looking at Kia's body, the way she lay there, the blood, the open eyes. Death. He was looking at death. He watched her. Dead. Then Jason roared like a beast in pain, the 5 razor knives of Freddy's glove plunging deep into his left shoulder. Krueger had attacked him from behind. Reacting with superhuman speed, Jason whirled and struck Freddy with the flat of his machete blade. The freak flew sprawling to the ground. They were near the new construction zone now, and plop! Jason caught Freddy a second time, sending the red-skinned devil bastard crashing into a rack of oxyacetylene tanks. Krueger yelped in pain as his back fell onto the tanks, toppling the canisters like 10 pins. He tried to reach out to slow his fall, but instead his glove accidentally sliced the stem valve off one of the tanks. An explosive expulsion of gas through the damaged valve sent the canister rocketing skyward like a missile, which gave Freddy one hell of an idea. Jason stomped heavily across the construction site in Freddy's direction, his machete ready to deal with the Elm Street maniac once and for all. He would hack Krueger into 13 bloody pieces. But Krueger had other plans. Laughing, he slunk over to a second rack of oxyacetylene tanks. Jason was even closer now, his measured stride beating in time with his festering black heart. Freddy smiled and fanned the razors of his claw hand. Then he proceeded to slice off the stem valves off all the oxyacetylene tanks, one after the other. Suddenly, the clearing was filled with the whooshing of escaped gas as the tanks explosively decompressed, then began firing off the rack like a mortar shell volley. Freddy kept well back as the tanks hurtled crazily outwards in all directions through the air. "Man the torpedoes!" One of them slamming with body-mashing force into the middle of Jason's chest, causing the masked killer to miss a step. Freddy continued the attack, slicing more valves, sending more tanks airborne. Most of the tanks rocketed off in random, useless directions, but enough of them found their target, hitting their mark and pummeling Jason backwards. Jason couldn't resist as gas tank after gas tank punched him back into the center of the construction area. A maze of scaffolding and piping that made Freddy feel almost at home. Wham! One last tank smashed into Jason's face, cracking his mask and sending him staggering back into a half-finished building. Arms flailing, Jason fell in an ungainly heap among the scaffolding, bringing the bolted framework crashing down on his head. Bar after bar, pole after pole, the entire scaffold fell down on top of Jason, instantly burying him beneath a heap of impossibly disjointed metal. There was a crackle of heat lightning in the distance. It illuminated a banner that lay askew on top of the collapsed pile of scaffolding. The banner read, "Camp Crystal Lake welcomes you back." Krueger laughed until he heard the groan of metal on metal and saw Jason Voorhees slowly fight his way up through the construction debris. Inch by inch, Voorhees pulled his way free until at last he was standing on his heavy-booted feet again. Another flash of lightning. "Where? Up here, asshole!" Freddy had taken up position on top of a nearby wall of scaffolding, from where he was able to look down on Jason. A pile of rebar was stacked together beside Krueger. Rebar, long, thin, stainless steel poles used to reinforce concrete. Long, thin, hard, deadly. Krueger upended the rebar stack and watched as the poles slid down through the air and fell down towards Jason Voorhees, standing on the ground. The metal shafts descended, shooting like spears towards the masked killer. One of the poles skewered Jason through his right shoulder, boring a hole clean through his solid undead mass of flesh and bone. A second shaft drilled neatly through Jason's left leg, both bars causing thick, glistening dark blood to ooze sluggishly out from Jason's shafted wounds. Jason staggered. Not only were the 2 lengths of rebar stuck through his body, but they went straight on and down into the ground. Voorhees hung there, run through, pinned like a bug on a board. yet partially supported by the 2 stainless steel rods that had speared him and were now fixing him to the dirt. Freddy laughed at the stupid idiots, then skipped off across the scaffolding in search of another weapon. If he couldn't kill Jason in his kid-ugly dreams, he'd just have to settle for the real thing in this world. Jason struggled to pull himself free from the rebar, but every time he moved, he began to fall, his body sliding further down the painful steel rods. He jerked backwards, trying to pull the 2 spears out of the ground. As he did, the rough steel poles rubbed and moved through the inside of his body, dragging and scraping through Jason's rotting innards. Thick black pieces of corpse pulp dripped out of Jason and fell onto the ground. But finally, ever so slowly, he was able to pull one of the bars free. Freddy could see Jason's pathetic struggle, but it didn't matter what Voorhees did now. He was way too late to save his sorry carcass. Krueger had run over to a heavy cement mixer. The machine stood on a wooden platform, up among the scaffolding. Connected to the mixer was a steel cable. Krueger followed the cable with his eyes, tracing it up from the mixer to the boom arm of a crane that stood high above the construction site. The maniac laughed in delight, then got himself behind the cement mixer and began to push it with his shoulder. Down below, Jason had just extracted the second rebar spear from the ground. Freddy pushed harder. Voorhees hadn't seen him. He had his own problems. Able to move at last, Jason grabbed hold of the first of the 2 spears, the one in his leg, and began to pull the rebar out through the wound. But it would take more than one tug to remove the entire length of the steel. 1 hand, 2, and, driven by some unknown instinct, Jason looked up to see the cement mixer swinging down towards his face. Pushed off the scaffolding and connected to the crane by the steel cable, the mixer swung down like a pendulum. Jason waited stolidly for the BAM! The mixer smashed into Jason, delivering a sledgehammer blow, before ricocheting away from his body, striking a wall, and then, like pendulums do, beginning its return swing. Jason Voorhees collapsed. The crushing mixer barely missed his head on its way back up towards the scaffold. High above, Freddy had long since left the platform where he'd found the mixer. Now he'd set his sights on a massive debris-filled cart. Depending on where the hockey-masked retard had got to, Krueger could either drop the cart on him or ram him with it. The cart was heavy, and Freddy had to strain to get it moving. He didn't have to put up with this lame exercise crap in the dream world. He caught a glimpse of Jason reeling, trying to get back up on his feet. The jerk was standing at the foot of a ramp that led right up to where Freddy was struggling with the steel garbage cart. Perfect! Freddy heaved the cart along to the top of the ramp, lined up the wheels, then let the metal roll! The cart hurtled down the ramp, its deadly cargo sure to turn Jason into Crystal Lake pulp, when suddenly the cart stopped. What? Its wheels had caught on something halfway down the ramp. Was it caught in a tangle of rope? Was one of the planks sticking up? What? What? Furious, Krueger snarled, then hurried down the ramp to dislodge the car. Just as the swinging cement mixer, already forgotten, completed its return journey and crashed into the side of the scaffolding. The supports beneath the ramp shook, then buckled, then collapsed completely. Before Freddy knew it, he was falling over the side of the sloping wooden platform, but he didn't hit the ground. Somehow his foot had got caught in the coupling that connected the steel cable to the suspended cement mixer. So now, like a total fucking moron, Krueger hung upside down, dangling in front of the cement mixer, which itself was swinging to and fro beside the scaffold. And he was gathering momentum. Left, right, smack! Krueger slammed into one of the construction site walls. He howled in pain, then found himself dropping, before suddenly jerking to a halt in midair once more. Krueger was stunned, and now hanging no more than 6 feet above ground level, he opened his malevolent yellow eyes. No! Jason had removed the rebar from his leg and was standing again. Freddy's sinister brows arched with fear. He tried to free himself, scrabbling in panic. Tried to. Jason still had a long, thin bar of stainless steel protruding through both sides of his shoulder when he laid a black leather-gloved hand on Krueger and dragged the snarling red and green wretch down from the cement mixer. Freddy tried to squirm free, but it was no use. Jason Voorhees locked him in a merciless bear hug. Freddy screamed, sunk his razors into Jason's neck. Jason shook his head violently and squeezed Freddy more tightly, squeezing the life out of him. They were gripped, locked, and mortal. Kaboom! The debris cart had come loose, charged down the ramp, and crashed into them with such force that both Freddy and Jason were rammed through the air out of the construction site. Limbs trailing, the immortal combatants were hurled an impossible distance before finally crashing to earth near the floating pier on the edge of the lake. Barely alive, vaguely conscious, Freddy Krueger cast a yellow-slitted look at his undead opponent, then slowly started to crawl away along the pier. The impact of the cart had dislodged the second piece of rebar from Jason's shoulder, leaving a huge open wound near his neck. His mask was cracked, charred, and bloodied. Thick, black blood dripped slowly down his vast torso. Jason got up, stumbling. Jason never stumbled. No matter how they attacked him, no matter what they did to him, he always sat up, smoothly, controlled, then rose mechanically to his feet. But not this night. Here now, Jason had been battered beyond belief. He staggered to his feet. He watched as Krueger tried to crawl away. Laurie had been right. This was truly a clash of ungodly titans. And as she so fervently hoped, Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees were killing each other. Slowly, ever so slowly, Krueger dragged himself along the length of the pier. Despite the agony, despite everything he'd just suffered, the maniac managed to break open a quiet sneer. He was heading for the water. Poor Jason's favorite thing, of course. Krueger tried to laugh, but just coughed, an awful rasping sound, thick with internal damage. By going to the end of the pier, Krueger wasn't heading into a corner. He wasn't trapping himself. He was daring that moron Jason to come after him. But this wasn't a dream, and Freddy wasn't unlocking any irrational fears or complexes buried deep in Jason's subconscious. Freddy wasn't to know that Jason had already spent countless undying years trapped at the bottom of Crystal Lake. In the real world, Jason Voorhees didn't give a good shit about water. Water was good for drowning people. He knew that from very personal experience. Jason stood tall now. His strength was returning. Krueger, where? Jason saw Freddy Krueger lying on his wretched belly, crawling like a worm as far as he could down to the end of the pier. Jason walked straight on after him. The wooden boards of the pier creaked and buckled as Jason bore down on Freddy. Jason swung his machete down towards his adversary's scarred, repulsive face, but Krueger was too fast. Jason didn't expect this. Freddy struck. He swiped his razor-gloved hand upwards and sliced off Jason's fingers. Thwip, thwip, thwip. 3 severed fingers fell to the floor, landing lightly on the wooden boards of the pier. Thunk! Followed by the machete. Catching Jason completely by surprise, the master of trickery jumped to his feet and snatched up Jason's machete in his left hand. Krueger stood there, roaring in triumph, the machete in his left hand, the razor glove on his right. Now, he had both weapons. He was in control. He was Freddy Krueger, and he was here to kick Jason's flaming ass. Once Will realized Laurie wasn't going to leave, he knew he couldn't either. Yes, he was hurting. Yes, he was bleeding. But he couldn't leave her like this, not alone against those 2 bastards. So he limped after her, and the 2 of them forgot about the boat entirely. They were going nowhere now. Their first thought had been to try and find some weapons, but then they'd heard all the commotion over from the construction site and had become distracted. Lori wanted to go and see what was making all the noise, but Will begged her not to. They knew what the noise was. It was Freddy and Jason breaking all hell loose. It was more important that they should go find something to defend themselves with, but what they'd found was Linderman's body. Another blow on top of everything they'd suffered. Another devastating shock. Another one down. Almost everyone they knew had died, and now the two of them were here alone. No one was coming to rescue them. No one had gone to fetch the police. No one was coming to deal with Jason and Freddy. Lori and Will were utterly alone. But still Lori was determined to see Krueger dead. Finally, they'd found some drums full of boat fuel. They knew the gasoline was good, but they weren't sure how best to use it. If they set fire to it, Jason and Freddy would just move away from the blaze. Nor could Will and Lori do much with the fuel drums themselves. The drums were just too heavy. Lori had suggested fuel bombs. Put some of the fuel in glass bottles, stuff a torn piece of shirt or something in, then light the damn things. Molotov cocktails everywhere. But they'd seen Voorhees at the rave. He'd been covered head to foot in flame, and it had done nothing. And as for Krueger, that guy looked like he'd already been torched many times over. And in their nightmares, he always took them to that boiler room, the place with the roaring furnaces. So they knew that the fuel tanks were somehow their best option, only they hadn't got the finer points nailed down. They didn't have a plan of action. Lori and Will were still working through all of this when Jason and Freddy came crashing down onto the pier behind them. The freaks had been thrown through the air over Lori and Will's heads. They weren't in the dream world anymore, so how was this possible? Now the two embattled teenagers could only look on in slack-jawed amazement as they saw Freddy launch his frenzied razor attack on the retreating, lumbering form of Jason Voorhees. Freddy totally had Jason on the defensive, hacking away at Jason with the ugly retard's own machete, snipping away at the open holes in Jason's mask with the piercing, ruthless finger blades, laughing all the while. Jason backed away, mute, futilely trying to defend himself. They were heading out towards the far end of the pier. For Lori and Will, it was now or never. Grimly, they both suddenly realized what it was they had to do. Will began turning a pump handle on top of a 50-gallon drum of boat fuel. The drum was connected to a long nozzle which Lori had taken, and was now pointing along the pier towards Freddy and Jason. Lori shook her head, her soul alive with pure defiance. "Not this time, Krueger," she vowed quietly to herself, and she held tight to the nozzle as it began to pour boat fuel all over the floating dock. Krueger and Freddy continued their dance macabre, oblivious to the flammable liquid running down the dock towards them. Back at the tank, Will staggered, clutching his side. "Lori!" he shouted. Lori turned and looked. Her first reaction was panic. Was he crying for help? His wound? No. Will was pointing to a metal tank on the other side of the dock. "The propane tank!" he called. Straight away she knew what he meant. She turned and sprayed fuel all over the propane tank and all the metal cylinders stacked around it. "Gotcha!" Freddy drove the two blades of his index and middle fingers clean through the eye holes in Jason's mask, the razors stabbing forward like cold steel nails of mutilation. Jason howled in bestial rage. Freddy pushed harder, driving his razors deeper into the mask. The knives pushed through Jason's eyes, tearing them wide open, gouging them, before cracking through into Jason's skull and on into the unholy gray matter of Jason's brain. Jason tried to pull away, but his face was impaled on the twin stab attack of Freddy's glove. Freddy gouged deeper. Voorhees howled. The tips of the razors burst through the back of Jason's malformed head in an explosion of rotted bone and viscous black pus. Jason staggered back, blinded, but by sheer virtue of his weight, he managed to pull free of the knives. The brute collapsed onto the wooden pier with a deafening thud. Krueger roared with sickening laughter. He paused to delicately lick the black pus off his blades, then pounced towards the wretched Voorhees. Krueger, the Raggedy Man, leaping through the air, limbs wild in a flurry of blurred red and green. The gas was all over the pier. Jason and Freddy were trapped. This was the end. Hold on. Laurie didn't smoke, no lighter, no matches. God damn it. Will had nothing either. Shit! They needed... The sky over the burning recreation hall glowed amber with the flame. Of course! Laurie ran back toward the flaming ruin and half fell, half dived up the short few stairs leading up to the burning porch. Debris fell, almost catching her, but she managed to duck out of the way. At this close range, the heat was truly intense. Laurie couldn't stand it for much longer. She felt the face of her skin drying with each passing second. Quickly, she bent down and managed to grab 2 burning pieces of wood from just inside the hall doorway. 2 burning pieces of debris, 2 flaming torches. Grunting with the exertion and recoiling from the almost overpowering heat of the fire, Laurie turned and ran as fast as she could, straight back to the pier. When she got back, she found Will almost lying on the ground. He was holding his wounded side and looked way too pale. No time to waste. Will feebly raised a hand, ready to take one of the torches from her, but she sped right past him and walked out onto the floating dock. She stopped only when she reached the edge of the gas they'd spilled. Then she held the torches, one in each hand, high above her head. "Krueger!" she shouted at the top of her voice. Freddy ignored her. Jason was beaten, blinded, whipped bad. The bastard's mask was a mess of cracks. Now it was really time to finish this thing. Freddy stood victorious over the beaten body of the Crystal Lake Killer and laughed. Voorhees was blind. He'd lost 3 of his fingers. He was pulverized, crushed, beaten, near to death. And now, Freddy had Jason's machete. What better way to finally put an end to this hulking moron? Laurie threw the first of the brands down onto the fuel-soaked boards of the floating pier. She threw it hard, hurling the torch as near to Freddy as she could. Immediately the dock went up in flames, flames that ran the length and breadth of the spilled gas, flames that raced down towards the end of the pier, towards Freddy and Jason. But Laurie wasn't finished yet. She took the second burning stick and hurled it at the gas-covered propane tank. The tank was ablaze in an instant. It was only a matter of time before it grew so hot that it would... Laurie turned and ran back to Will. She put an arm around him and dragged him as best she could, and then the 2 of them turned tail and ran for their fucking lives. At last, the end, the ultimate finale, the death of Jason Voorhees! Freddy lifted the machete, pulled back his arm to make sure he got in a good mask-splitting, decapitating swing, when suddenly his eyes were caught by a reflection in the machete blade. Something bright, something moving fast. Fire! Fire like the flames in the boiler room where he'd first been murdered by the parents of Springwood. Fire like the flames of hell where he'd since spent most of his depraved, nightmarish existence. Fire. All-consuming, all-destroying, agonizing fire. Krueger held back, terror wiping the murderous smile clean off his devil face. The wall of flame was racing down the pier towards him. No! Jason suddenly sat up and thrust his fist right into Freddy's gut, bursting a hole through Krueger's noisome stomach. Freddy cried out in pain. The searing fire. Jason! Freddy fell back, reeling from the disemboweling blow and retreating from the oncoming inferno. Suddenly, Jason was at him. Voorhees stood up, reached out with both arms, then clamped his hands hard around Freddy's razor claw. Freddy wriggled his fingers, trying to cut, trying to slice Jason, but his efforts were in vain. The Crystal Lake maniac locked the glove in a vice-like grip. Jason pulled. He heaved with all of his might. Jason tore Freddy's arm straight off of its socket, sending a spray of unholy blood pluming into the clear water of Crystal Lake. Freddy screamed, turned and shoved the machete forward, straight through into Jason's black heart. This was ultimate violence. This was psychotic, undead annihilation. Lori and Will ran down to the shoreline next to the pier and made straight for the water. She looked up. She could see them. Freddy driving the machete through Jason's chest. Jason swinging helplessly at Freddy with Freddy's own arm, slashing the air with the infamous razor glove. The wall of fire had reached them, any second now, and the propane tank. Lori and Will dived into the lake. The tank and all the surrounding cylinders were blown sky high. Freddy and Jason were blasted off the pier and into the water. The two of them locked in a double death grip, fighting to the last. They sank deep into the water, just as the surface of the lake caught fire beneath a layer of ignited boat fuel. Freddy and Jason were dead. After a while, Lori dragged herself out of the water, then helped Will to clamber up onto the wrecked pier. The end of the pier was gone, blown apart. What was left of the wooden jetty was mostly ablaze, except right here by the shore where the fire had been extinguished by the force of the blast. And the lake. There was no way anything could have survived the explosion, no way. And even if they did, the lake was ablaze. They'd either burn or drown there. Lori and Will lay on the charred wood of the dock. Will looked real bad. She cradled him in her arms. My God, it's over. Lori's plan had worked. At that moment, at that precise second of realization, all the exhaustion, all the fear, all the sorrow, it all came flooding out of Lori in a wave of overwhelming emotion. Tears ran down her cheeks. Now that Freddy and Jason were dead, the tension poured out of her. She hadn't realized just how much she'd been holding in. But now, the relief. Her tears spilled onto Will's face. His eyes were closed. I'm going to get you help, okay? She promised. Just stay with me, Will. Stay with me. Will's eyes flickered open. He was losing consciousness. Not going anywhere, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I promised you. Ah! What? Lori looked up to see Freddy Krueger erupt with a roar from the depths of the burning lake. No, it can't be. Freddy Krueger, Springwood's most hated bastard, dragged himself up onto the wreckage of what remained at the end of the pier. His body was smoking, burned. His sweater and hat were gone, burned away. His scarred, pitted skin glistened with greasy black oil water. His right arm was missing, leaving just a torn, jagged stump of hatred. In his left hand, he held the machete of Jason Voorhees. This was the new Freddy, the Freddy who'd fallen to Earth and been sent to hell and back. The Freddy they'd tried to kill. The Freddy who'd been locked in steel-edged death with Jason Voorhees. Machete versus glove. Fire versus water. Nightmare versus reality. All burned away, all cremated, leaving nothing but seething feral rage. No jokes. No taunts. No more fucking games. Freddy Krueger charged toward them, raking the air with Jason's bloody machete. Lori looked around frantic for a weapon, for anything. She could hear his racing footsteps coming down the pier towards them. She could feel the heat of Krueger's almost tangible fury above the warmth from the blazing fire on the lake. Run, Will said weakly, lying flat on his back, barely able to lift his head. He was no good. She'd have to leave him here, go on alone. But Lori shook her head. Hadn't they promised they'd never leave each other again? Resolute, Lori stood up and placed herself between the semi-conscious body of her first love and the ranting, machete-wielding rampage of the charging dream butcher. Her gesture was just that, a gesture. Lori had no weapon to defend herself with. She had no way to fight Freddy, no way to save herself or Will. But she wouldn't be afraid. She would deny Krueger this one last pleasure. He could kill her. He could hack her in two, but she wouldn't scream, wouldn't let him kill her soul. Freddy seethed over the two stricken lovers, the machete leveled and ready to chop the little fuckers into Hades. Lori looked at Krueger, gazed into his wild yellow eyes, and saw nothing but cruelty, anger, and loathing. Lori stared into the eyes and saw pure, undiluted evil. The machete swung high. Lori was ready. Krueger howled as his own 5 razor fingers of death burst out through the front of his chest. Fine droplets of Freddy's black blood puffed through the air like a spray, landing on Lori's clothes, her hands, her face. Krueger's eyes glazed with disbelief. His black-lipped mouth fell open. His shark-toothed jaw hung wide with shock. He looked down. His own glove. My own motherfucking glove! Krueger had been punched through the back with brutal force by someone using his own murdered blades. He had been punched through the back by Jason, indomitable, relentless, indestructible, unstoppable. Jason Voorhees! Lori fell back, sickened by the jet of Freddy's foul blood. She could see Jason. He was in the water, clinging with one hand to the edge of the ruined pier. But how could he reach? Now she saw it. Jason's other hand, holding on to Freddy's arm, the arm with the razor glove. Jason had used Freddy's arm like a machete. He had lunged forward, his body half rising out of the lake, and had stabbed Freddy with the razors on the end of Krueger's own arm. Time stood still. The two maniacs seemed to hold their final place for an eternity. Freddy gasped. He'd been skewered with his own blades. Blood trickled from the corners of his charred mouth. Foul-smelling loops of intestine sagged and excreted through the open wound. Jason waited, half in and half out of the water, not letting go of the glove until he was certain that... Freddy's arms dropped, releasing the machete. The machete slipped from his fingers. It fell, landing point first into the wooden pier. Finally, Jason let go of Freddy's severed arm, leaving it to hang by the claw stuck in Freddy's back. Now! Lori's eyes shot in the direction of the discarded machete. She could do it. Krueger saw her, saw the look in her eyes. He watched mutely as she ran forward and took hold of the weapon. He tried to speak, but all he could do was cough up gobbets of foul black blood. She could do it. Lori pulled the machete back, ready to strike. She stared at Krueger, held his weak and venomous gaze, and said, "Welcome to my world, bitch!" Then she swung with all of her might and used Jason's machete to hack Freddy Krueger's neck clean off the trunk of his scabrous little bastard neck. Krueger's head hit the pier, then rolled over into the lake with a pathetic splash. His headless body dropped to its knees. It swayed for a moment before Will staggered up alongside Lori and kicked the decapitated corpse in the chest, knocking it back off the pier and into the water to join Krueger's head. The body sank out of view. Freddy, beheaded. His mutilated corpse now lying dead in the real world at the bottom of Crystal Lake. After all the noise, after all the violence, all the horror, silence. The fire on the lake and the fire in the recreation hall both roared at full strength as Lori stood bloody and grimy, still holding on to the machete. In the end, it was she who had killed Freddy, not... She heard a noise, creaking, the groaning of wooden boards. Quickly, machete at the ready, she turned to see where the sound had come from. She looked down and saw Jason Voorhees. Somehow Lori knew that Jason's supernatural life force was ebbing away. Jason let go of the pier and slid back into the water. He raised his mask to look up at Lori, and for a moment she remembered her dream of little Jason, drowning in the water of old Camp Crystal Lake. She'd reached down to help him, to try to rescue him, but now she was looking into the blackened eyes of Jason the man, Jason the killer. Jason's eyes squinted out at her through the cracks in his broken mask, what was left of them. Somehow his eyes had already healed a bit since Freddy had gouged them out with his glove, and in them Lori could see. Lori could see something in Jason's eyes. Some thought, some feeling, but what? Recognition? Acceptance? Peace? Jason's head sank beneath the surface of the water. The lake was reclaiming its own. Lori looked down. The hockey mask. She could see it sinking, submerging. Then it too was gone. its battered white plastic the last thing she saw. A mere few bubbles rose to meet the surface of the lake, and then stopped. Jason Voorhees was dead. The burning lake spread out before Lori as she looked out from the edge of the ruined pier. Trey, Blake, Freeberg, Stubbs, Linderman, Gibb, and Kia, all dead. But now it was over. Their nightmare was over. The real horror had been defeated. Will stepped up beside Lori, took her hand in his own. They had their whole lives ahead of them, lives they could spend together. There was so much they needed to do. She needed to rebuild her relationship with her father, needed to go back to Sheriff Williams, needed to put an end to Weston Hills. They embraced. They had won. It was time to go home. Epilogue. Lori placed a new candle in the window of her bedroom at 1428 Elm Street. 2 months had passed since the nightmare first begun for her, but she felt uneasy about the place. Trey had died here, and her mom. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Hearing the voice, Lori turned from the window and saw Will lying in her bed. He was under the covers and didn't seem to be wearing a stitch of clothing. "You're kidding," she smiled. "It's all I ever wanted." "We could wait, though," offered Will. "I mean, if you—" "Forget it, Will. My dad's gone for the whole weekend. We've got the house to ourselves." Still wearing her bustier and thong, Lori clambered into bed next to him. "Now quit stalling," she said suggestively, "and kiss me." Will leaned over and kissed Lori on the lips. When eventually he lay back again, she looked at the long scar on the side of his chest. She ran her fingers over it, a souvenir from Jason. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "Not so much anymore." Lori lay back and stared up at the ceiling. "It's funny. After everything that happened, I actually ended up feeling a little sorry for Jason." Will snorted derisively. "I was in his nightmare," countered Lori. "I saw Freddy torturing him. Saw him drowning that scared little boy. Ugh." She shivered. Over these 2 months she tried hard to bury the memory of everything that had happened to them. But in her heart of hearts she knew she never would. She knew that the events of 9 weeks ago would haunt her for the rest of her life. She could never forget. "Freddy got what he deserved," said Will. "They both did." He placed his hand on her, got her to turn on her side to face him. "Now enough about them," he smiled. "This is our night, remember?" Lori nodded and hugged Will close. There was so much to talk about and to think about, but maybe not tonight. "I love you so much, Will." She couldn't believe they were finally together like this, nor could Will. "I love you too," he replied with true feeling. "I always have. There wasn't a night back at Weston Hills when I didn't fall asleep thinking about you, Lori." Lori's eyes welled up with tears, and they kissed again. The kiss was hungry. It was the kiss of 2 young people, totally giving themselves over to one another for the very first time. "Will?" Lori said softly. Will ignored her and grabbed her more tightly. Then he squeezed her hard, too hard. "Will, easy!" But he wasn't listening. Suddenly he was all over her, kneading her flesh, biting at her throat. "Will!" He placed a hand inside Lori's vest and ripped it wide open, bearing everything she had to offer. Lori tried to push him back. "What's wrong with you?" she complained. He said nothing at all. He pulled her arms up over her head, crossed her wrists, then pinned them down with his forearm. Lori didn't understand what was going on. He was being too rough, way too aggressive. This wasn't fun anymore. "Get off me!" she shouted, but he kept her pinned in place. She struggled. He smiled. Then he raised his free hand over her face and laughed as Freddy's 5 razors burst out through the ends of his fingers, shredding away the flesh of his hand. Lori screamed as sheets of skin and blood fell across her naked breast. She screamed. Will laughed. From inside the window of 1428 Elm Street came the screaming sound of death, born on the ripping evisceration of 5 deadly knives. The end. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Freddy vs. Jason, the novelization of the film by Stephen Hand. Gotta say, I really enjoyed this book. The prologue was amazing. Chapter 1 was amazing. All that backstory, tying Freddy's dead, all the Freddy movies, Jason Goes to Hell, all the Jason movies, tying them all into this, unlike, the actual movie of Freddy vs. Jason did, was amazing. I love that. Explaining stuff like how the lake connected to the sea. Love that. I mean, for the most part, most of the book was just carbon copy of the movie, which a lot of novelizations are that way. But there was a lot of slight differences, and some big ones too, including this ending, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. If you want more detailed discussion and review from me on all the chapters, you can check out the playlist for this book if you're listening to the unabridged version right now. And at the end of each upload of each chapter or two, I talk about those chapters. If you're listening to the unabridged version, then I'm just kind of breaking down a little bit about the whole book and mostly the ending here. So yeah, I really enjoyed the book. I was hoping Stubbs would have got a little more time in the book and that Freddy would have got more than one kill. But all in all, Stephen Hand did a great job writing this book, keeping it fun and fresh, even though it was a rehash of the movie. And I cared for the characters a lot more in the book than I did in the movie. A lot more. Freddy's scenes, his nightmare, his dreamscapes were a lot more fun. The fight between Freddy and Jason in the boiler room, that seemed more badass in the book. Because it kind of seemed kind of goofy in the movie, but in the book it just seemed a lot more badass and awesome. Now, as far as their fight in the real world, oh man, I thought the book handled that great. It didn't really add nothing to it, but it did go into more detail about what was going on. It wasn't, cutting back and forth as much as the movie did. And their fight on the pier seemed a lot more deadly and intense than it did in the movie. And it was just great. And I love how the book mentioned in the real world how Freddy was, trying to back up to get Jason so he can get him into the water. And the author even came out and said, but this was the real world. This wasn't a dream where Freddy could manipulate Jason and find his innermost fears. Freddy was unaware that Jason had been in Crystal Lake and chained to the bottom of it before. This would not bother him. Because that was a big thing a lot of us were talking about, in the comment section, and what I was saying throughout this book, is the whole Jason afraid of water thing. It's like, no. It had to be that Freddy was just, manipulating him and using his dream power, to really dig down deep inside of Jason, to Jason's version of himself whenever he's a little boy, and those insecurities and that fear of drowning. And thank you, Stephen Hand. Thank you so much for clarifying that here in the last chapter and epilogue. Thank you, for saying Freddy was going to be in for a rude awakening because Jason was not afraid of the water. I think a lot of us have been... I think a lot of y'all will be happy that was in the book, like I was. As soon as I read that part, I made a note to be sure to discuss that. But we all know how the ending went down. Jason, coming out, stabbing Freddy with his own glove, and then Freddy getting decapitated. Welcome to my world, bitch. I love that line from Lori. Awesome line for a final girl. But then we get the ending, the epilogue. The whole ending of Jason coming out of the water holding Freddy's head. Not here. That was a ending they shot after the movie was already finished, after they had tested it with crowds. They went and filmed that scene because they weren't happy with the real ending, which is what we got here in the epilogue of the book, with Will becoming Freddy. And I like what this ending implies, because, the bastard child of the Freddy movie series was A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge. And I really feel like this ending, even like the deleted scene that they filmed of this for the movie and the book here now that I've read it, I've always felt like this was kind of a little throwback to Freddy's Revenge, you know, because that's what it is, you know. And it's like Freddy possessing Will, just like Freddy possessed Jesse, you know, to get his revenge. And so I always thought that was really cool. It's kind of like this was like kind of like a reboot, and they were setting up. Like, here you go. We referenced, the book referenced all these other Freddy movies, and I think the ending was a reference to Nightmare 2 with the whole possession angle. I love that ending. It leaves it ambiguous, leaves it open. I kind of prefer that to the whole Freddy winking thing, but there's still something to say about Jason, you know, holding Freddy's head and Freddy winking to let you know they're still going on, because this ending, you know, Freddy's back. And Jason's dead, or at least we think he is. I never believed Jason's dead, even though the book said Jason was dead. You know, 2 pages before that it said Freddy and Jason were dead, and we know how that ended. They weren't dead yet. So, anyways, this has been a really fun book to narrate. I hope you all thoroughly enjoyed this book as much as I did. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I look forward to putting out more great slasher content. Not to mention the library of audiobooks I've recorded here on the channel that you can listen to. I just want to entertain you all and share my rare out-of-print horror novels with all of you. I'm looking forward to my episode of out-of-print slashers when sometime in the future I'll be doing an episode on this book, and I've got so much I want to say about it. But until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thank you for listening, and as always, pleasant dreams!
Hi, this is Jeffrey Reddick, creator of Final Destination.
Greetings, Slashaholics. This is David Bergantino, author of the Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror books, the Bard's Blood horror Shakespeare books.
Hey guys, this is Jason Brooks, Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th Vengeance.
Hey, this is Slasher Pepper.
Hey everybody, it's CJ Graham, Jason, Friday the 13th Part 6.
This is William Patterson, known to Friday the 13th fans as Eric Morris.
Hi, this is Deborah Voorhees from Friday the 13th Part 5.
Hey folks, this is Adam Marcus, director of Jason Goes to Hell and Secret Santa.
Hello kiddies, this is John Kassir, the voice of the Crypt Keeper.
Hi, this is Kane Hodder, better known as Jason from Friday the 13th, Victor Crowley from Hatchet.
And you're listening.
You're listening.
And you're listening.
And you're listening.
I just want to make sure you guys know you're listening.
You are listening.
And you are listening.
And you are lucky enough to be listening.
Okay, boils and ghouls, you are listening.
You are listening
to the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
The 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To 80s Slasher Librarian.
To 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
to the 80s Slasher Librarian. Keep listening, or I'll kill you.